The Justice Department has filed a motion opposing the release of the affidavit supporting the Mar-a-Lago search warrant. The DOJ says disclosure of the affidavit details at this time would cause significant and irreparable damage to the ongoing criminal investigation. Last week, former President Trump's home was searched by the FBI. It was executed in connection to an investigation into his handling of White House records. 11 sets of classified documents were recovered, and now Republican members of Congress are demanding to know more details about exactly what was seized. For more on this question, let's bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion. Hey there, Nikole. So several Republican members of the House Judiciary Committee have sent letters to the Attorney General, the FBI Director, and White House Chief of Staff about that search on Mar-a-Lago. What are they asking for and why?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, basically, they are demanding that the Biden administration save their records as it pertains to this search warrant, and they're simply requesting more information as it pertains to this search, how it was carried out, and any documents surrounding this. And so, most of these, of course, are members of the former president's, they're considered allies, if you will, who put forth this letter to, as you see, the Attorney General, the FBI Director, and Ron Klain. But I think also worth noting that this comes as there are other members of Congress demanding information from the Biden administration, more specifically the Director of National Intelligence, to not only provide more information about what happened, but also potentially to even see some of these classified documents that were retrieved. That is a request, a bipartisan request, by the way, from the Senate Intelligence Committee. You also have the House Intelligence and House Oversight Committees also putting forth a request to the Director of National Intelligence and the Office of Director of National Intelligence to provide an immediate review and damage assessment of those documents. I talked to one member of both of those committees today who said, they simply want to make sure that, there was no compromised information that could have, been exposed or potentially compromise our national security as it pertains to our adversaries. So those two committees are also seeking some type of classified briefing as well, which this particular lawmaker told me they expect to get at some point.
Well, Nikole, former President Trump is also now calling for the return of documents that were reportedly seized from his home based on executive privilege. Does executive privilege apply to the former president in this situation?
I'm not a legal expert, but what I can say is this is an argument that the former president has used before, especially as it pertains, for instance, to the House Select Committee investigating January 6th. And, what many members of that committee have said is that, executive privilege is not absolute. And so one would argue that that could also be the case here. Certainly we'll kind of have to see as things play out, but it is something that the former president has used before in terms of trying to defend why he should not have to hand over certain documents from his administration or certain information. And ultimately, in the case of the January 6th committee, he actually lost out on some of those executive privilege claims as it pertained, in fact, to the National Archives, because ultimately this was a separate issue, but one that was litigated in court. And ultimately, the National Archives was able to turn over some information to the committee that the former president protested. So unclear if, we'll see a similar dynamic play out in this case. But again, it's an argument certainly that the former president has tried before.
Yeah, I want to dig a little bit deeper on this, Nikole, because Mr. Trump has also claimed that he declassified the records that were taken during the FBI search. Some of those documents reportedly relate to the Crossfire Hurricane Russia investigation. What are you learning about the process for these records to be declassified and whether, in fact, they were?
Yeah, well, it is an interesting argument to make. And quite frankly, just in talking to other members of Congress, particularly Republicans here on Capitol Hill, many of them have made that argument in terms of, why the former president would have these documents. I asked one lawmaker in particular, why do you think the former president had these classified documents, and do you think it's appropriate? And this lawmaker's response to me was just, well, the president has the right and the authority to declassify documents, but it's not necessarily that simple. Another member that I talked to said there is a pretty extensive process in terms of trying to determine whether or not something should be declassified. And even through some of our reporting, for instance, through law enforcement sources, some of them have told us that basically, as investigators are trying to sift through all of these boxes with documents, they are still trying to determine, the level of classification, and also that some of these documents may have been so sensitive that they do, in fact, have to be read in a secure location, and they have to be ordered and numbered in a certain way. And so consequently, in some instances, it's a situation where that agency, where the document originated, that agency would be the one to determine whether or not something could be declassified. So it's much more complicated and broader than just, the former president saying he has this power and authority to declassify anything he wants.
Certainly it is complicated, in part because we know that the declassification is one issue, or the classification of those documents is one issue, but then the other document is actually turning over the presidential records to the National Archives, which CBS News learned early on was the reason behind this search warrant. So sticking just with the classification part of it, Nikole, I'm wondering if you have learned anything more about any larger legal implications if the records were in fact not declassified.
Well, what we know from the search warrant is that it appears that there is concern surrounding the mishandling of federal documents, which could be in violation of at least 3 different laws, one of which would involve unauthorized possession, for instance, of national defense information, which is kind of a provision, if you will, within the Espionage Act, which would be pretty consequential. One lawmaker I talked to today said that, he's not sure if the former president's actions go that far, especially as we're trying to learn more. But that just kind of shows the serious nature here. In terms of some of those other laws, they're kind of pertaining to, for instance, it being illegal to conceal or destroy potential documents. So that is kind of what the scope of this investigation is, if you will, in terms of some of these potential violations by the former president, if proven. And, these are serious offenses, which, again, if the former president were to be found guilty or his associates in any way, I mean, these are all violations that could carry multiple years in jail or prison. So worth taking note. Obviously, the former president has asked for these documents back, has insisted that he is willing to work with the Justice Department in any way that he can, because he feels that this is a dangerous time in our country, and he, says that he's willing to help out the country in any way he can. That, according to a new interview that he conducted today, for the first time, speaking out publicly, really for the first time since this raid.
Well, there is a lot going on, and we appreciate you breaking it down for us, Nikole. Thanks.
You bet.